Hello everyone, and welcome back to Unsaid Hours. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. In small towns, people grow up believing that the worst things happen somewhere else. That is what made this story stay with so many people. It was not just brutal, it felt impossible. The kind of thing you expect to hear about on the news from a distant city, not in a quiet Irish town where everyone knows each other's names, families, and routines. Even now, years later, it still carries that same weight. Because the violence was shocking, but the familiarity of the victims made it worse. I come from a small town in Ireland, and the neighboring town where this happened was even smaller. Places like that have their own rhythm. They are quiet, predictable, and close-knit in a way that makes tragedy feel especially unnatural. Crime was rare. When people talked about trouble, they usually meant arguments outside a pub, petty theft, or some local drama that would be forgotten in a week. Serious violence did not feel like part of life there. It felt like something that belonged to another world. That is why what happened in 2014 hit so hard. The victims were an elderly couple, both in their 70s, well known and well liked in the community. They had lived there for years and were the kind of people others spoke about with real warmth. The husband had been a maths teacher, remembered as patient and kind, the sort of man students trusted. The wife had worked as a nurse, and my own father had known her through work. He always described her as one of those genuinely good people who made others feel safe just by being present. Together they had the kind of quiet reputation that settles around decent people in small towns. They were not loud or dramatic. They were simply known as lovely. They had 2 sons. One lived a normal, steady life and stayed in touch with his parents. The other was more troubled, though the full extent of it was not something everyone understood at the time. Then, on that morning in 2014, that troubled son took a hatchet and killed both of his parents inside their own home. Even now, saying it plainly does not make it feel more real. If anything, the simplicity of the sentence only makes it harder to process. Something so savage entered a house that should have represented age, routine, and safety. What made the story even more horrifying was the brutality of the attack. The injuries were severe, far beyond what people in that area could emotionally absorb when the details began to spread. It was not a quick act. It was not a single blow in a burst of anger. It was extreme violence carried out with force and repetition. The kind of violence that leaves behind not just death, but a scene so terrible that anyone who hears even a softened version of it feels sick. After the killings, he locked the house and left. That detail has always disturbed people because of how cold it sounds. Not only the murders themselves, but the fact that he then moved through the next steps as if carrying on in some separate reality. He went to his brother's engineering company and handed over his wallet to an employee, reportedly saying something close to, "I won't be needing that." It is one of those details that sounds almost unreal in hindsight, the kind of sentence that only becomes chilling after you know what came before it. At the time, it may have sounded strange. Later, it sounded like something from the edge of a broken mind. What happened next has been told in slightly different ways over the years, as stories often are in small communities. Some versions say builders eventually discovered that something was wrong. Other versions say the couple's other son went to check on them later, not knowing what had already happened. In the version most people repeat, he went to the house, knocked, got no answer, and felt that something was immediately off. He knew his parents should have been there. When no one opened the door, he went around to the kitchen window, found it open, and climbed inside. What he found was beyond anything a person should ever have to see. The house was filled with blood. Both of his parents had suffered multiple wounds, and the damage was catastrophic. It was clear at a glance that they had not died peacefully or quickly. The horror of discovering your own parents like that is hard to even imagine, and that is one reason the story lodged itself so deeply in local memory. Even people who never saw the house, who only heard fragments afterward, carried the weight of the image. Some details were repeated too often, others people tried not to say aloud. But once a community hears that something so violent happened behind the door of a familiar home, the whole place changes slightly in the mind. News spread quickly, as it always does in towns that size. The shock moved from one house to another, from one kitchen conversation to the next, with the strange speed that grief and disbelief seemed to travel. People woke up thinking it was a normal day, and by afternoon were talking in low voices about something they could barely take in. There was fear, yes, but also confusion. It is one thing to hear that two strangers have been killed. It is another to hear that kind elderly people you might have passed on the street had died so violently at the hands of their own son. It shook something in the community's sense of order. As more information came out, people began asking questions about his mental state. At first, there was only horror. Then came the attempt to understand, not to excuse what happened, but to explain how something like that could happen inside an ordinary family in an ordinary town. During the investigation and later in court, it became clear that he was suffering from severe paranoid schizophrenia. That diagnosis changed the shape of the story, but it did not make it easier. In some ways, it made it sadder. What emerged from the trial was a picture of a man living in a reality that no one else around him could see. He believed his mother was trying to poison him. He believed people were conspiring against him. He believed aliens were going to take him to the Matrix. He believed the IRA was trying to recruit him. These were not passing strange thoughts. They were fixed beliefs, solid to him in the same way ordinary reality is solid to everyone else. That is what makes severe psychosis so terrifying, both for the person experiencing it and for the people around them. It does not feel unreal from the inside. It feels undeniable. One of the most disturbing details to come out later was what he believed he had heard the night before the murders. According to testimony, he believed his mother was asking him to kill both her and his father. In his mind, it was not murder. He believed he was sending them to heaven. That detail is horrifying in a very specific way, because it reveals just how completely his thinking had separated from reality. What to everyone else was a brutal and unforgivable crime may have felt to him like obedience or mercy inside a mind that was no longer functioning within the real world. Because of that mental state, he was found not guilty of murder by reason of insanity. That verdict is one of the hardest things for communities to live with in cases like this. Legally, it makes sense. Morally and emotionally, it feels much harder. People understand what insanity means in the courtroom, but grief does not become easier because the law has found the right category. Two elderly people were still dead. One son still lost his parents in an unimaginably violent way. Another son had not only killed them, but had done so while deeply unwell, trapped in a mind that had become dangerous and unrecognizable. There is no version of justice in a case like that leaves anyone feeling whole. Afterward, he was committed to the Central Mental Hospital in Dublin, where he remains. For some people, that fact causes anger. They hear hospital instead of prison and feel that something is missing. For others, it adds another layer of sadness, because it forces them to confront the role severe mental illness played in destroying an entire family. Most people, if they are honest, feel both things at once: anger at the violence, grief for the victims, horror at the illness, pity without forgiveness. It is one of those rare cases where every emotional response feels incomplete on its own. What lingers strongest in the area, even now, is not only how they died, but who they were before it happened. People still remember them fondly. They remember the husband as a kind teacher. They remember the wife as a compassionate nurse. They remember the ordinary details of them, which in some ways are harder to hold than the crime itself. Because once you know a person was real in that everyday way, a parent, a colleague, a neighbor, someone's former teacher, someone your father once worked with, the distance disappears. The story stops being a crime story and becomes something closer, heavier, almost personal, even if you were never in that house. For me, that closeness is what made it so disturbing. My father had worked with the woman. He knew her as more than a name in a report. That changes how a story enters your life. It stops being a headline and becomes a wound in the edge of your own world. It forces you to accept that terrible things do not need dramatic settings. They can happen in ordinary homes, in quiet towns, among people who are remembered as gentle and good. That realization is difficult to shake. It changes how you think about safety, about familiarity, about what might be happening behind the walls of houses you pass every day. And in small communities, events like this do not disappear. They become part of how people mark time. They remember where they were when they heard. They remember the stunned silence that followed. They remember how conversations changed, how voices dropped, how people looked at each other differently for a while afterward. The story remains, not because people enjoy repeating it, but because some events are too shocking to ever fully settle. They do not belong to gossip. They belong to memory. That is why people still talk about it. Not only because of the violence, though that alone was enough to scar a community, but because it happened in a place where nothing like that was supposed to happen. Because the victims were known and loved. Because the person who killed them was not a stranger from outside, but their own son, lost inside a mind that had turned against reality. Because the tragedy did not fit neatly into a simple category of evil or innocence. It was horror, a mental illness, grief, and disbelief all tangled together. And maybe that is what makes it so hard to forget. Not just that it happened, but that it shattered the illusion people in quiet places like to hold on to. The belief that being small, familiar, and close-knit somehow protects you from the worst parts of human life. It does not. Sometimes the darkest things happen in the places least prepared to imagine them. Even now, when people mention that neighboring town, this story eventually rises to the surface. Not because anyone wants to dwell on it, but because some tragedies leave a permanent mark on a place. They become part of its emotional landscape. People remember the couple not only for the way they died, but for the lives they had before that morning, for their kindness, their work, and the ordinary decency that made their deaths feel even more unbearable. That is what stays with me too. Not only the brutality, not only the trial, not only the madness behind it. What stays with me is the image of a quiet town, waking up to something it could barely understand, and the knowledge that even in the calmest places, under the most ordinary roofs, terrible things can be gathering in silence long before anyone knows to be afraid. Some houses feel haunted, even when nothing supernatural has ever happened in them. Sometimes what lingers is not a ghost, but memory. That is what this house became for me. I was younger when I first learned the full story, and it scared me deeply then. It does not scare me in quite the same way anymore, but even now, when I think about that place, it still feels heavy, as if what happened there settled into the walls and never fully left. My great aunt and uncle lived in a house that had a small store attached directly to it. That kind of setup was not unusual where they lived. A lot of people ran family businesses that way, with the shop connected to the home, so work and daily life blended together. Before opening the store, they had done a lot of renovations to the property. As part of that process, they had a security system installed for both the business and the house. That made sense. They were going to have money, stock, and valuable things on the property, and they wanted to feel protected. The house itself was beautiful. It had that old, elegant feeling some houses carry, where everything seems filled with history, even if you do not know the details yet. One of the things that stood out most was my great-aunt's collection of grandfather clocks. She loved them, and they were everywhere. Almost every room had at least one. Some were large and decorative, others more simple, but all of them looked carefully maintained and clearly expensive. Even as a child, I could tell those clocks were special. Looking back, I am sure that collection alone was worth a great deal. One night, long after the store had closed and everything should have been quiet, my great-uncle heard a sound downstairs. It was not some massive crash that would send anyone into instant panic. It was just enough to wake him and make him uneasy. Like most people would, he got up to check on it. He probably thought it might be something minor, maybe even nothing at all. Instead, he walked into a burglary in progress. There were people inside the house. From what we were eventually told, my great-uncle surprised the intruders by coming downstairs. They had not expected to be confronted. Things escalated immediately. One of the burglars stabbed him 4 times. That is the part that always made the story stop feeling like something distant and dramatic and start feeling brutally real. It was not just a robbery. It was direct, new physical violence inside their own home. My great-aunt woke up when she heard the commotion. She opened an upstairs window and began screaming for help as loudly as she could, hoping the neighbors would hear. It is easy to imagine burglars fleeing at that point, panicking once someone in the house started making noise. But they did not run. That is one of the details that makes the story so much darker. Instead, they carried my great-uncle back upstairs. He was badly injured, and they brought him into the bedroom, tied him to the bed, and tied my great-aunt up as well. Then, while the two of them lay there bleeding, terrified and helpless, the burglars continued robbing the house. They took what they wanted, valuables, items from the home, whatever they had come for, and then left my great-aunt and uncle tied up there after everything was done. They survived, but only just. My great-aunt's screaming had been heard by neighbors, and those neighbors called the police. When officers arrived, they found blood in the hallway, and my great-aunt and uncle still tied to the bed, injured but alive. It is one of those details that always stays with you. The idea of how close it came to ending differently. If help had come later, if the neighbors had ignored the noise, if anyone had hesitated, they might not have survived at all. As horrifying as the attack was, the investigation afterward made it even worse. The men who had broken in were not random criminals who had chosen the house by chance. They were connected to the very company that had installed the security system. That meant they knew how the system worked. They knew how to bypass it. They knew the layout of the property, where the valuables were likely kept, and how to move through the house without setting off the protections my great-aunt and uncle had paid for to feel safe. That betrayal is one of the ugliest parts of the whole story. The people trusted to make the house secure had helped make it vulnerable instead. Eventually, they were caught. But being caught did not erase what had happened. It did not remove the blood from memory or change the fact that the house had been the site of something violent and intimate. After that, being there always felt different. Even once everything was cleaned up and repaired, even once the rooms looked ordinary again, the house never felt completely normal. It was as if the knowledge of what had happened settled over everything, and the clocks did not help. Those grandfather clocks made the place feel even stranger afterward. When a house is quiet and full of clocks, every tick becomes impossible not to notice. In an ordinary house, that might feel comforting or old-fashioned. In that house, with that history, the ticking felt sharp and eerie. It was like being surrounded by reminders that time had passed, but had not erased anything. Every room seemed to hold its breath between ticks. For a long time, we did not actually know the full story. The adults kept it from us because we were children, which made sense. All we knew was that there was something different about the house, something that made the adults act a little more careful, a little more watchful. But the full truth only came out later because of something almost absurd in comparison. We used to play this game with our cousins, where one of the uncles would chase us around in the dark to scare us. It was loud, chaotic, and exactly the kind of reckless fun children love. We would scream, laugh, run through the house, and hide, all of us completely out of breath and full of adrenaline. It was silly and harmless, at least to us. One day, we played that game at my great-aunt and uncle's house. It was the first time we had ever done it there. We were racing through the house in the dark, screaming and laughing, making all the kinds of noises that sound very different from outside than they do from inside. The neighbors heard us and called the police. Suddenly, the police were there. I still remember the shock of it. One moment we were kids playing some stupid game in the dark, and the next, there was a police officer standing there telling us to quiet down because the neighbors had been alarmed. I explained that we were just playing and that nothing bad was happening. The officer listened and then said something that changed the whole way we understood the house. He told us the neighbors were worried because of what had happened there before. That was when the story finally started to come into focus. Once we learned what had happened, everything about the house made sense in a way that was both terrible and clarifying. The heaviness we felt there, the way adults carried themselves differently in those rooms, the strange silence that seemed to sit beneath the ordinary sounds of the place. It was no longer just a big old house with clocks and a store attached. It was a place where something truly violent had happened, and where people had nearly died in a way that shattered the safety of the home forever. After that, every visit felt different. Nothing had changed physically, and yet everything had changed. That is what trauma does to a place. The walls stay standing. The furniture gets replaced or repaired. The rooms look normal again. But once you know what happened inside them, they stop feeling innocent. The house became a place layered with memory. Not my own direct memory of the event, because I had not witnessed it, but the family memory of it. The kind that settles into stories, glances, and silences. That is why it stayed with me. It was not because I thought the house was haunted by ghosts. It was because I began to understand that places can hold on to violence in a very human way. A house does not need paranormal activity to feel wrong. Sometimes all it needs is a history people cannot quite stop hearing when the rooms go quiet. In that house, the clocks, the silence, and the knowledge of what had happened all worked together until the whole place felt marked. Even now, when I think about it, I do not feel the same kind of fear I did as a child. It is not that breathless, immediate fear anymore. It is something heavier and more reflective. I think about how quickly safety can collapse. I think about betrayal and how much worse it is when the danger comes from someone trusted. I think about my great aunt at the window screaming for help, and the neighbors hearing her, and how close everything came to ending in tragedy. And most of all, I think about how some places are not haunted by spirits. They are haunted by reality, by the things that actually happened there, by the violence that changed the people who lived through it, and by the way everyone else feels it afterward, even if they were not there that night. Those are often the hardest stories to shake because there is no distance created by fantasy. It really happened. The blood was real, the fear was real, the survival was real. That is what changed the house forever. And that is why, even now, when I picture those rooms full of grandfather clocks and hear the imagined ticking in my head, the house still feels heavy. Not because something supernatural lived there, but because something terrible once did. Some houses feel wrong long before anything happens in them. That was how it was with the house I grew up in. Even as a little girl, before I had words for fear beyond simple things like darkness or bad dreams, I knew there was something about that place that did not feel normal. It was not one single event that made me feel that way. It was the whole atmosphere of it, the way the house seemed to hold itself, as if it were listening when no one was speaking. When my family first moved there, I remember feeling uneasy almost immediately. It was a 2-story house on an ordinary residential street. Nothing about it unusual from the outside if you were just passing by. The streetlights worked. The neighboring houses looked normal and warm at night. But our house felt different, and I noticed it in a way that stayed with me. No matter how bright the streetlights were, the light never seemed to reach our front yard properly. The houses beside us would sit under a soft, yellow glow, but our porch and yard stayed sunken in darkness, as if the light stopped at the edge of the property and refused to go any farther. Even as a child, that bothered me deeply. It did not feel like simple shadow. It felt as though the darkness around our house belonged there. I told my parents again and again that the house felt haunted. I said it in the plain, serious way children say things when they are not trying to be dramatic, but truly want to be heard. They never took me seriously. To them, it was an old house making old house noises, and I was just a kid with too much imagination. I understand that now, in a way. Adults often want a simple explanation, because simple explanations make children easier to comfort. But comfort and truth are not always the same thing, and even then, I knew their explanations were not enough. Inside the house, there was never a real sense of peace. It felt unsettled even in daylight, as though the air itself held tension. One of the worst parts was the kitchen sink. It dripped constantly, a slow, steady drip that seemed louder at night than during the day. My parents had it fixed more than once. Plumbers came, checked it, said the problem was handled, and still the dripping always came back. It was not just annoying. It became part of the house's rhythm, like a pulse you could not ignore. At night, lying in bed, I could hear it faintly through the silence. Drip, pause, drip. It sounded less like plumbing and more like counting, like something patient, something waiting. My bedroom was at the very top of the stairs, which made everything worse. The staircase was narrow and old, and every sound carried up it. Some nights after everyone else had gone to sleep, I would hear footsteps moving on the stairs. At first, I tried to make sense of them. Maybe it was one of my parents going to get water. Maybe the house was settling. Maybe wood sounded stranger at night. But the footsteps never felt random. They were slow and deliberate, too measured to be dismissed easily. Sometimes they would stop halfway up, and the pause was the part that frightened me most. It felt as if someone was standing on the landing, listening. Other times the steps would continue all the way toward my room, and I would lie there frozen under the blankets, every muscle locked tight, waiting for them to stop before they reached my bed. There was one moment in particular that never left me. I was probably 8 or 9 at the time, and I had gotten sick enough to stay home from school. My mom stayed with me, and we spent most of the day upstairs in the living room, watching television and resting. The house had that strange daytime quiet it gets when only 2 people are home. A quiet that somehow feels heavier than ordinary silence. At some point, my mom noticed the air conditioning was still running downstairs and asked me to go turn it off. I remember walking down the stairs slowly, mostly because I still felt weak. Halfway down there was a small landing where you could lean over the railing and see into most of the downstairs area. From that spot, you could see the living room, the kitchen, and down the hall toward my parents' bedroom. I had no reason to stop there, and yet I did. It was not a decision so much as a pull. Something made me lean over the railing and look. My parents' bedroom door was slightly open. That alone should not have mattered. Doors are often left open. But the moment I noticed it, a cold feeling went through me. I stared at the door for a second, and then slowly it began to open wider on its own. There was no breeze, no sound, no one there. Just the slow movement of the door until it stood fully open. I knew it was only me and my mom in the house. That knowledge is what made the fear hit so hard. I screamed and ran back upstairs as fast as I could, crying before I even reached her. When I told my mom what I had seen, she brushed it off almost immediately. She said I was sick, that I was tired, that my imagination was running away with me. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But deep down, I knew I had not imagined it. That certainty sat in me quietly afterward, heavier because I had nowhere to put it. Another experience happened late at night and unsettled me in a completely different way. My dad used to leave for work very early, usually around 3 in the morning. He never came upstairs before he left, but I always knew when he was gone because our alarm system made a short beeping sound as he armed it on the way out. One night, I remember hearing that familiar beep. Even half asleep, I recognized it and knew my dad had just left for work. I rolled over and drifted back to sleep. Not long after, I woke suddenly to a strange sensation on my face. At first, I did not understand what had pulled me awake. Then I realized it had felt like a kiss, but it was not warm and comforting the way a parent's kiss should be. It felt cold, slightly damp, just enough to jolt me into full awareness. I lay there without moving, too frightened to even open my eyes properly again. I stayed like that, barely breathing, as if any movement might invite something worse. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me back to sleep. The next morning, I asked my mom if she had come upstairs during the night to kiss me. She looked confused and told me no. Later, when my dad came home, I asked him too. He said no as well and reminded me that he never went upstairs before leaving for work. That answer never left me. Even now, it still sits in my mind like a question I was never meant to answer. If it was not my mom and it was not my dad, then who touched my face while I was sleeping? But the most terrifying experience happened when I was even younger, around 5 years old. It was during one of those storms that seem larger than they should be when you are a child. Thunder shook the whole house. Lightning flashed through the windows so brightly that every strike lit the rooms for a split second and then threw them back into darkness. I was already scared, so I took my little nightlight and went down the hall to my older sister's room. I plugged it in beside her bed and climbed in next to her because I thought I would feel safer there. Her bedroom door was open. My face was turned toward the doorway, and beyond it, the hall was completely dark. No hall light, no glow from downstairs, just blackness. I pulled the blanket over my head but left a small hole so I could breathe and peek out if I needed to. Eventually, I must have drifted off. Then a crack of thunder jolted me awake. My heart was racing before I even understood why. I looked through the little opening in the blanket toward the door, and that was when I saw it. A pale white face was staring directly at me. Even now I can still see it. The face was almost glowing against the darkness, too white, too clear. One eye stood out more than anything else, a sharp, piercing blue that seemed fixed on me with a horrible steadiness. I could not scream. I could not move. Fear locked my whole body in place. It felt as though every part of me had frozen except my eyes. We looked at each other for what felt like forever, though it was probably only 30 seconds. But fear stretches time in cruel ways, and those seconds felt endless. Then I saw more of it. A pale, thin body seemed to rise into view and slowly turn away from the bed. It did not rush, it did not jerk or lunge. It moved calmly, almost casually, and walked out of the room into the black hallway beyond. That somehow made it worse. There was nothing frantic or dreamlike about it. It moved with quiet certainty, as though it belonged there more than I did. After it disappeared, I realized I was shaking so hard that the blanket trembled around me. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, staring at the doorway, convinced it would come back. I never told my parents about that one. Even at 5 years old, I knew they would not believe me. Some part of me understood that saying it aloud would only make me feel more alone with it. So I kept it to myself, and maybe that made it lodge even deeper in my memory. Years passed in that house, and eventually I reached high school. By then, the place had become a collection of unease for me. The darkness outside that never seemed natural. The dripping sink, the footsteps on the stairs, the bedroom door opening by itself. The cold kiss, the pale face in the doorway. None of it had ever turned into something I could prove, and because of that, I carried it quietly. Then my family finally moved out. I thought leaving would free me from it. Instead, the memories followed me. Even in a different house, I still thought about those nights. Not every day, but often enough that the old fear never fully disappeared. Curiosity eventually got the better of me, and years later I started looking into the history of the house. I did not really expect to find anything. Most old houses have stories attached to them if you look hard enough. I assumed that even if I found something, it would be vague or meaningless. What I found instead made my blood run cold. An elderly woman had died in that house years before my family ever lived there, and the room where she died was my room. When I found that out, everything I had spent years trying to explain away came back all at once. The feeling of being watched, the footsteps, the strange tenderness of that cold kiss, the pale face I had seen as a child. I showed my parents what I had discovered, and for the first time, they did not laugh it off or tell me I had imagined everything. They went quiet. That silence meant more to me than if they had spoken. For the first time, they believed me. That was the moment the whole thing settled into something almost worse than fear. Validation, because part of me had always wanted to be wrong. I wanted all of it to be childhood nerves, dreams, old house sounds, bad timing, anything ordinary. But once I learned about the woman who died there, and once my parents stopped dismissing me, all those experiences rearranged themselves in my mind. They no longer felt like scattered, strange moments. They felt connected, like something had been there all along, and I had sensed it long before I understood what it might be. Even now, years later, those memories remain vivid in a way most childhood memories are not. I can still picture the darkness outside the house, as if the streetlights themselves avoided it. I can still hear the slow dripping from the sink and the careful footsteps on the stairs. I can still see that bedroom door opening by itself from the landing. I can still remember the cold, wet feeling of something kissing my face in the dark. And most of all, I can still see that pale face watching me from my sister's doorway, while thunder shook the house around us. I do not know exactly what was in that house. I cannot prove every experience meant the same thing. Maybe some of it was fear. Maybe some of it was being a child in an old home, with too much silence and too many shadows, but not all of it. I know that in the deepest part of myself. Not all of it. Some places leave marks on you that do not fade with distance. That house did. And sometimes, when the night is especially quiet and the world seems to hold its breath for a moment too long, I still think I can hear footsteps climbing the stairs. Some memories do not fade as you get older. They wait for you. This is one of those memories for me. I am 16 now, but what happened that night still feels close, like it is sitting just behind my eyes, waiting for the room to go quiet enough for me to hear it again. I was around 7 or 8 years old when it happened. Back then, I had an Xbox Classic in my room, and like a lot of kids that age, I loved staying up later than I was supposed to whenever I thought I could get away with it. That night, I had been completely pulled into whatever game I was playing. Hours slipped by without me noticing. I was a child in that strange little bubble kids create for themselves late at night, where the rest of the house disappears, and the only thing that feels real is the screen in front of you. At some point, I glanced at the clock and saw it was around 2 in the morning. That was late enough to make me feel guilty straight away. The house was completely silent, the kind of deep silence that only happens when every other person is asleep, and you are the only one still awake. I remember realizing I had pushed it too far and deciding I needed to go to bed before I regretted it the next day. So I switched off the Xbox, watched the screen go dark, and then turned off the light in my room. The moment the room went dark, everything changed. It is hard to explain, but anyone who has ever been a child awake too late at night probably knows what I mean. A room can feel familiar 1 second and completely different the next just because the light is gone. My room had always felt normal while I was gaming, full of noise and movement and distraction. But as soon as the screen went black and the light went out, the darkness felt heavier than it should have. It did not just settle around the room, it seemed to press inward as if the walls had moved a little closer while I was not looking. I climbed into bed and pulled the covers up, trying to settle down. For a few seconds, everything was still. I could feel myself beginning to drift, that drowsy space between wakefulness and sleep. Then I heard it. At first, I almost dismissed it because it was so faint. It sounded like whispering, but far away, not clear enough to understand. The closest comparison I can make is that soft, distant sound of classmates whispering in a classroom when the teacher is talking. You cannot make out the words, but you know it is voices. That is exactly what it sounded like. Low, murmuring, human. I froze instantly. Even as a kid, I knew something was wrong with the sound. I remember lying perfectly still, listening, my heart already beginning to beat faster. I tried to tell myself it was the house making noise, the wind, pipes, anything. That is what people do when something unsettles them. They reach for the most ordinary explanation first. But after a few moments, I heard it again, and this time it was closer. That was when fear really began to creep in. I knew everyone else in the house was asleep. My parents had a habit of locking their bedroom door at night, and the whole house had that dead stillness of deep sleep. No television, no footsteps, no movement, nothing except that whisper. I remember becoming acutely aware of how late it was, how dark my room was, and how alone I felt in that moment. The sound did not fit the silence around it. It sounded too deliberate, too clear in the wrong way. It did not sound like something happening by accident. It sounded like a voice. I pulled the covers up over my head. I left only the tiniest gap so I could breathe. It was the instinctive thing children do when they are terrified, as if a blanket can create safety simply by blocking your view. For a few seconds, there was silence again, and I almost convinced myself it had stopped. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe staying up too late had made my brain start filling in sounds that were not there. Then I heard it again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The whisper was clearer now, steady and unmistakable, and it was saying the same thing over and over. Come into the living room. I felt something drop inside me the second I understood the words. It was not just fear, it was the shock of hearing something that should not have been there suddenly become direct. Up until that point, I could still pretend it was just noise. But once the words were clear, that option was gone. I remember squeezing my eyes shut under the blanket, my whole body tense, my hands trembling. I did not want to hear it again, but it kept coming. Come into the living room, over and over, in that same low whisper. And each time it sounded closer. At first it felt like it was somewhere down the hallway. Then it seemed to move nearer, as if the voice was drawing closer to my bedroom door. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest so hard that I almost thought it might give me away. As if whatever was outside could hear it and know exactly where I was. I tried to tell myself I was dreaming, but I knew I was not. I had just been playing Xbox. I had just gotten into bed. I was fully awake. That certainty made it worse because it meant I had no safe explanation left. The whisper never changed in tone. That was one of the worst parts. It was not angry. It was not loud. It was calm, repeating the same phrase with the patience of something that did not need to rush. That calmness was more terrifying than shouting would have been. It felt less like a threat and more like an invitation, and that somehow made it feel even darker. With every repetition, it seemed to move closer until it no longer felt like it was outside my room at all. It felt like it was beside my bed. Then it felt like it was right next to my head. The last time I heard it, I could have sworn the voice was whispering directly into my ear. That was when I broke. I sat bolt upright in bed and screamed as loudly as I could. Not the kind of scream you do for attention, not even the kind that comes from a nightmare. It was raw panic, pure terror coming out all at once because my body had finally hit its limit. My scream tore through the silence of the house, and almost immediately I heard movement. My parents' bedroom door opened. Footsteps rushed down the hallway. My mom came running into my room and turned on the light. The second the room filled with light, everything changed. The whisper was gone. The darkness shrank back into ordinary corners. My room became my room again, but I was still shaking so badly I could barely talk. I was crying and trying to explain what had happened, the words tumbling over each other because I needed her to understand that I had not been asleep, that I had heard something, that it had been real. She sat on the edge of my bed and held me while I tried to calm down. She told me I was okay, that I was safe, that I had probably scared myself by staying up too late. Maybe she thought I had half-dreamed it. Maybe she assumed it was a nightmare that felt real because I was overtired. I remember trying to insist that I had been awake, that I had not dreamed the voice, but I do not think she really understood just how real it had felt to me. Still, she stayed there until I calmed down enough to fall asleep with the light on. After that night, I never felt fully at ease in that house again. Something had changed. Or maybe it had always been there and I had only noticed it properly for the first time. Either way, I carried that feeling with me afterward. Even when nothing strange was happening, I often felt like I was being watched, especially at night or whenever the house went quiet. It was never easy to explain. It was just a sense that the house was not truly empty, even when everyone else was asleep and the rooms were dark. I never heard that whisper again, at least not exactly, but the memory of it stayed with me in a way that almost felt alive. It sat in the back of my mind, waiting for quiet moments, waiting for darkness, waiting for me to remember. Sometimes I would lie awake and think about those words, the way they had sounded, the way they had moved closer, and the more I thought about them, the less I wanted to know why they had been said. Sometime after that, my mom and I ended up talking about the night it happened. I do not remember what brought it up, only that somehow the conversation returned to that old memory. That was when she told me something I had never known before. The previous owner of the house had died there, not just in the house, in the living room. According to what she told me, he had been lying there for quite a while before anyone found him. The way she described it was blunt and disturbing, the kind of detail adults sometimes forget. A child or teenager will carry with them forever. She said the scene had been so bad that they practically had to scrape him off the floor. The moment I heard that, the whole memory shifted. I felt the same cold rush of fear I had felt that night in bed. The words came back into my head immediately, clear as if I were hearing them again for the first time. Come into the living room. Suddenly, those words felt different, darker, more specific. It no longer sounded like some random, creepy thing my half-asleep brain might have invented. It felt targeted, intentional, as though whatever had whispered to me had known exactly what that room meant. I remember sitting there after my mom told me, trying to process it, not really knowing what to say. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as coincidence. I wanted badly to believe that my mind had connected two unrelated things and turned them into one disturbing story. But another part of me could not let go of how real it had felt. That is the part that stayed with me. Not certainty, not proof. Just the reality of the fear itself. The fact that I know how awake I was. I know how clearly I heard the words. I know how each repetition seemed to move closer until it felt like something was leaning over my bed in the dark. People can explain a lot of things away with dreams, imagination, exhaustion, and fear. Maybe some of those explanations matter, but none of them fully erase what I felt that night. And that was not the only strange experience I had. There were other things over the years too, other moments that were hard to explain, each one adding a little more weight to the feeling that something in that house was not right. I do not need every person to believe that. I know how these stories sound. I know people like to reach for logical explanations, and maybe in some cases, they are right. But when you are the one lying in that bed, hearing a voice in the dark say the same words again and again, logic feels very far away. I have come to believe that some places hold on to what happened inside them, not always in dramatic ways. Sometimes it is quieter than that, a feeling, a presence, a moment that should not happen, but does. Maybe houses remember, maybe pain leaves a trace, maybe loneliness does too. I do not know. But that house never felt empty to me, not truly. It felt occupied in some way I could never see clearly enough to understand. And that night, it felt like whatever was there noticed me, noticed that I was awake, noticed that I was alone in the dark, noticed that I was listening. I still do not know what whispered to me. I am not sure I ever will. Maybe that is part of why the memory stayed so strong. A thing with no answer keeps breathing in your mind. It never settles, it never closes. All I know for certain is that the fear I felt was real. So real that even now, years later, I can still remember the weight of the blanket over my face, the pounding of my heart, the silence between each whispered sentence, and the final horrifying moment when the voice seemed to reach my ear. Some experiences pass and leave only fragments. This one left a mark, and sometimes, late at night, when a house is quiet in that same heavy way and darkness feels just a little too close, I still hear those words in my head, exactly as I heard them then. Come into the living room. I live in Southern California, about 30 minutes from the border, in a place most people would call ordinary. It's the kind of area built from sameness, miles of chain stores, parking lots stretching under harsh white lights, the faint smell of asphalt and fast food on warm nights. The sort of environment that feels safe because it's familiar. For months, social media threads had been circling about attempted abductions in local parking lots. Women approached near their cars, someone trying to open the passenger door, a vehicle hanging back too long after they'd left. Walmart, Vons, Costco, it didn't seem limited to one spot. People reposted the warnings with captions like, "Be careful out there," and "Trust your gut." But since no one had actually gone missing, most brushed it off as rumor. So did I. The independence had always come naturally to me. I liked running errands alone, moving at my own pace without small talk or company. Walmart at night was my usual routine. A weekly visit around 10:30, calm aisles, no lines, the hum of fluorescent lighting instead of crowds. There was never any reason to think that something could be waiting for me in the same place where I bought detergent and cereal. That night began like any other. The air had that dry stillness you only get in the borderlands at night. Warm wind pressed against concrete. The smell of dust and exhaust drifting across the lot. Inside, the store was half empty. I moved through my list, paid, and walked toward the automatic doors with 2 plastic bags cutting into my fingers. The moment I stepped outside, the contrast hit me, the light, the sound. A Walmart's glow bled into the dark, leaving long stretches of uneven shadow between the pools of overhead lamps. Cartwheels rattled somewhere far off. A single moth circled lazily around the nearest light post. I started toward my car. That's when I saw him. He stood on one of those small landscaped islands between rows, just bare dirt, a thin tree, a concrete edge. He was close to my car, maybe 2 vehicles away. Ball cap pulled low, phone in hand, staring down like he was reading something. I almost didn't think about it. People loiter in lots all the time, waiting for someone, calling an Uber. Existing in public isn't a crime. Still, something about the picture was off. He wasn't leaning against the light pole or pacing. He was angled toward my side of the lot, motionless, the phone frozen in his hand. I tried to ignore it. A gust of wind moved through the trees. Keys pressed in my palm as I walked. When I got about halfway there, he shifted. It was subtle. He took a few steps. Not toward the store, not toward his own car, but just enough to close the space between us. He pretended to glance at his phone screen again, like there was an invisible line timing our movements. A cold pulse ran through me. One of those sensations so strong it doesn't leave room for doubt. You just know something's wrong. Every sound seemed to drop away. The hum of lights, the buzz of an overhead fixture, even the bag handles creaking against my fingers felt too loud. For an instant, I thought about speeding up, making a break for the driver's seat. Then I pictured what would happen if he matched me step for step. If a hand grabbed my wrist before I could unlock the door. My voice of reason came out flat inside my own head. Stay calm. So I stopped, pretended to look through one of my bags, fishing around for something I hadn't lost. I exhaled slowly. Then I turned, casual, not abrupt, and walked right back toward the bright glass doors. I didn't look behind me. I didn't need to. That heavy silence of being watched followed me all the way to the entrance. When the automatic doors opened, the air conditioning hit me like a wave. I stepped inside and stopped by the carts just past the greeter stand, pretending to check my receipt while I caught my breath. Heart pounding so loudly it felt visible in my throat. Through the glass, I could still see the man. He lingered a few seconds, then drifted toward a car parked near the row I'd been walking through. The engine started. He didn't drive away. He circled. Once, twice, the headlights sliding across other vehicles. He wasn't leaving. That was the moment when the unease turned into certainty. This wasn't a coincidence. I caught the eye of the older employee stationed by the exit, the one who checks receipts when people leave. His name tag read Marcos. I walked up and asked quietly if he'd mind walking me to my car. I tried to sound casual, but my voice shook a little on the word please. He didn't hesitate. Sure, he said, like it was the easiest request in the world. I noticed his lips tighten. He understood before I explained. We stepped out together. The scene looked the same, yet everything inside me felt rewired. The same pavement, the same flickering lights, but each shadow now carried consequence. Marcos walked slightly ahead, scanning. I followed, gripping my keys like they could do more than open a door. We reached my car. The lot was quiet again, too quiet. The yellow cart corral rattled softly in the breeze. I didn't see the man or the car. Maybe he'd parked just out of sight. Maybe he was still circling. I unlocked the door, slid inside, and locked it from within. Marcos waited until the engine started before giving a small nod and heading back. His figure disappeared into the store's glow. I didn't sit there like I usually did to check my phone. I backed out fast, tires crunching. Only when I turned onto the main road did I realize how hard I was shaking. My hands were slick on the steering wheel. My breath came short, uneven. That kind of adrenaline doesn't fade quickly. At home, I turned the TV on for noise but couldn't stop replaying the parking lot in my mind. The dim light, his angle toward my car, those precise steps timed with mine. I tried to convince myself it might have been nothing, but every second replayed more clearly than the one before. By midnight, I was scrolling through neighborhood Facebook groups. What I found chilled me. Post after post from women, different towns, same story. A man in a parking lot pretending to text, approaching as they neared their vehicles, sometimes standing near a planted tree, sometimes driving circles when they went back inside. None of them had proof it was the same person, but every detail lined up like copies of the same moment. One comment thread mentioned two men, sometimes switching vehicles. Another said security footage had captured a car trailing someone toward the freeway before peeling off. Nobody knew what happened afterward. Reading those accounts made my stomach twist until I thought I might be sick. It wasn't just a random creep. This was a system that relied on looking harmless. The idea settled over me slowly, horribly. How easy it is to hide danger inside ordinary scenes. A man with a phone in a parking lot, a car drifting by, nothing loud, nothing cinematic, just patient calculation. Living close to the border always gave life a kind of edge you could ignore if you wanted to. That night, I stopped ignoring it. The proximity to another country suddenly meant something darker. How fast someone could vanish. Once over that invisible line, jurisdiction dissolves. Our names become paperwork no one wants to finish. I thought about what would have happened if I'd shrugged off the feeling, if I'd kept walking instead of turning. Maybe he'd have said something friendly, offered to help load the bags, and by the time I realized what was happening, a van door might have slammed shut behind me. That image looped behind my eyelids whenever I closed them. In the days that followed, I couldn't step into a parking lot without that heartbeat-quick surge of awareness. I began running errands in daylight, double-locking the car as soon as I got in. Not because I expected someone to be there every time, but because I knew now that they could be. Safety wasn't guaranteed. It was conditional. Before that night, the world had edges I never questioned. Errands were just errands. The border was just a line on a map. But when I picture that man now, I see how easily he blended in. He wasn't skulking in shadows. He stood where anyone could see him because he knew most people wouldn't look twice. The memory still visits me in flashes. The soft rumble of his engine after I'd walked away. The perfect stillness of him pretending to scroll, waiting for me to come back. Sometimes I wonder how many others he's tried it with. How many looked up too late or ignored the same instinct because politeness won over fear. Maybe none of them ever turned around. Maybe that's why we only hear fragments, rumors, warnings, posts without follow-ups. And I think about how thin the line really is between an ordinary night and a life that vanishes without a trace. I wasn't smarter or braver than anyone else. I was just lucky enough to listen to that small voice in my head that said, "Don't go any closer. Luck, in the end, is quieter than fear. You only realize you had it when you understand what could have happened if you hadn't." My mother never meant to frighten me with her stories, but this one has never left my mind. It isn't a tale of ghosts or monsters, nothing that screams impossible. It's disturbing because it almost became something far worse, and because everything about it was so ordinary right until the moment it wasn't. It happened in the 1970s, back when danger seemed like something that happened in other places to other people. My aunt was 16 then, living in a small town where everyone still waved at passing cars and left doors unlocked. Trust was part of the air people breathed. Hitchhikers weren't strangers to fear. They were travelers with stories. Teenagers like my aunt believed that the world was mostly kind, that bad people lived in headlines, not in their neighborhoods. That summer was hot, thick with the hum of cicadas and the smell of asphalt softening under the sun. My aunt and her best friend, let's call her Linda, had planned a simple day by the community pool. They swam, lay on their towels, shared a bag of potato chips, and laughed about school and boys. Nothing about it hinted that anything would go wrong. But danger never announces itself. It just waits for silence. While my aunt was talking to Linda, she felt someone step close behind her. Before she could react, a knee pressed sharply between her legs, and a hand grabbed her chest. There was no warning, no sound, just that sudden violation and her own startled breath catching in her throat. She shoved him away hard, turning to see a man in his 20s, tanned skin, messy dark hair, a casual smirk that didn't match his act. He muttered something she couldn't fully hear and walked off, calm as if nothing had happened. For an instant, she thought she had imagined the whole thing. People around the pool kept laughing, splashing, existing. The world didn't stop for her shock. Linda saw her face and knew something was wrong. My aunt whispered quickly what had happened, her voice tight. They gathered their things and left. They didn't have a plan, just the silent agreement that staying there felt wrong. As they walked through quiet streets simmering in late afternoon light, they began trying to shake it off. He was just some creep, they told each other. It was over. But a few blocks later, my aunt noticed something. A bright splash of yellow coming up behind them. A Volkswagen Bug, the kind of small, happy-looking car advertisers used in magazines. It drove by slowly before turning a corner. "Similar car," Linda said, attempting to sound casual. Still, they saw it again an hour later, parked near the drugstore where they stopped to buy sodas. The same color, maybe the same car. A small shape behind the wheel. A man whose face looked too familiar. My aunt caught his reflection in the vending machine glass. She couldn't swear it was the guy from the pool, but her stomach tightened anyway. That uneasy coincidence started to repeat. The yellow bug kept appearing. Once by the park, once near the convenience store where they lingered too long, deciding on gum. Sometimes it was behind them, sometimes parked ahead. Each time it slipped back into traffic just as they tried to reassure themselves. They began laughing nervously about it. Because that's what people do when they're afraid, but don't want to be. By evening, the air was cooling. The sunlight thinned into orange bands above the roofs. They were waiting on the curb beside the library, expecting Linda's mother to pick them up after her shift. She was late. 10 minutes passed, then 20. In those days before cell phones, lateness wasn't panic, it was patience. But as dusk deepened, the yellow bug appeared again. This time it idled across the street, headlights off, engine humming like a quiet question. The driver's silhouette was barely visible, just a shape watching them through glass. Linda tried to joke again, though her voice broke halfway through. Maybe he just has nowhere else to go. Eventually, the car pulled forward and stopped beside them. The window rolled down. The man inside smiled. "You girls look stuck," he said. His voice was easy, friendly. "I can give you a ride home if you want." He didn't seem threatening. There was no drunken slur, no visible anger. He leaned against the frame with a kind of practiced patience, waiting as if sure they'd say yes. My aunt's first thought wasn't fear, it was relief. The way he spoke felt safe, almost normal. She hesitated, then stepped toward the car. Linda moved with her, and that was when headlights flashed behind them. Brighter, familiar. Linda's mother's blue station wagon pulled up to the curb, tires crunching on gravel. The sound cut through the moment like a bell. The man's expression didn't change at first. He simply glanced toward the approaching car, then back at them. "Looks like you're covered," he said lightly. He gave a short nod, shifted into gear, and drove off without haste, disappearing into the dark stretch of street ahead. The girls climbed into the station wagon, breathless but trying to hide it. Linda's mother apologized for being late, an extra errand at work, some forgotten paperwork. They didn't tell her much, just a vague story about a weird guy offering a ride. The rest stayed between them, heavy and unspoken. After that night, everything continued as usual. School started again. The summer folded into memory. The incident at the pool became one of those stories my aunt pushed away, something unpleasant but not defining, until several years later. It was the late 1970s, and news of a serial killer began to fill the papers. Ted Bundy. His face was on television. My aunt was folding laundry when she saw his photograph. Her hands froze on a white t-shirt, and the room seemed to narrow. The smile on the screen, the casual, self-assured one, looked too familiar. And then the reporter mentioned it. Bundy's car, a yellow Volkswagen Bug. It was like the floor tilted beneath her. She remembered the sun flashing off the Bug's rounded hood, the way the driver had watched them in silence, the almost kind tone in his voice. She thought of the pool, the sudden knee between her legs, that smirk that wasn't quite human but disguised well enough for the world not to notice. She didn't say anything for a long time. It felt absurd to be certain. Maybe it wasn't him. It could have been another man, another Bug. Coincidences happen. That's what she told herself over and over. But late at night, those reassurances didn't hold. She would replay every moment, the careful friendliness in his voice, the way he didn't insist when Linda's mother arrived, just slipped away. How often they'd seen him that day without realizing they were already being watched. Over time, she found news articles linking Bundy's movements to that region and season. Not exact, not provable, but close enough to make her skin crawl. Close enough that the simple act of waiting for a ride could have become a headline with her picture attached. When my mother told me this story years later, she didn't dramatize it. She just described the facts. The pool, the man, the car, the narrow escape that didn't look like one until hindsight turned it monstrous. What chills me most isn't the possibility that it was really Ted Bundy. It's how easily horror can disguise itself as normal life. The day didn't end with screaming or police sirens. It ended with a drive home, a quick dinner, maybe television before bed. From the outside, nothing extraordinary happened. But somewhere in the quiet spaces of that evening, chance rearranged itself to keep my aunt alive. If Linda's mother had lingered another minute at work, if traffic had moved differently, if my aunt had opened that car door just a beat sooner, the story would have ended in silence. Sometimes I think about how thin that margin is, how survival can hinge on coincidences so small you can only see them later. My aunt was lucky. That's all it was. Luck, timing, a late arrival that rewrote what could have been tragedy into a memory retold decades later. And every time I picture that yellow Bug easing away from the curb, I imagine the same car turning another corner somewhere else. The headlights catching on another pair of unsuspecting faces, because luck, after all, doesn't last forever. This is one of those stories that has stayed with me for years, the kind that comes back when you least expect it. It does not come back with blood or screaming or anything dramatic like that. It comes back in quieter ways. A crowded bar, a stranger smiling too easily, a friend saying, "Go on, it'll be fine." It comes back in that sick feeling you get when you realize how close an ordinary night can come to turning into something final. A few years ago, my sister had a friend who went away on holiday with a group of girls. They were young, excited, and in that stage of life where going abroad still felt like stepping into a version of yourself that only existed for a week or two each year. The trip was meant to be simple, Drink too much, sleep too little, spend money badly, laugh at things that would not seem funny at home. The kind of holiday people take because they want a break from being careful all the time. She was from Ireland, and like a lot of people going away for the first time without family, she treated the trip like permission to be lighter than usual. Not reckless exactly, just open. Open to long nights, to meeting people, to doing the kinds of things that become stories later. The first few days passed the way those trips usually do. Beach in the daytime, bars at night, cheap cocktails, loud music. Pictures taken in bad lighting that somehow still looked good because everyone was happy. Nothing about it stood out. Nothing hinted at what would later become the only part anyone remembered. It happened near the end of the trip. She and her friends went to a bar that was busy without being packed. The kind of place where tourists and locals mix together easily. It was warm inside, warmer than it should have been, and every surface seemed sticky with spilled drink. Music was playing loudly enough that people had to lean in close to talk. It felt safe in the way a lot of public places do. Bright enough, crowded enough, normal enough. That was where she met him. Later, when she had to describe him, she struggled with that more than anything else. Not because she had forgotten him, but because there had been nothing memorable in the way people expect. He had not looked dangerous, he had not acted aggressive, he had not hovered or forced himself into her space. If anything, that was what made it worse. He had been easy to talk to. He was friendly from the start, calm, funny in a low-key way. He did not come on too strong. See, he spoke to her like someone who knew how not to alarm people. He asked where she was from, how long she was staying, whether she liked the place. Normal questions. He listened to her answers. He bought her a drink, but not in a way that made it feel transactional. When her friends drifted in and out of the conversation, he handled that naturally too, as if he had done this many times before. That part matters. It would be easier maybe if men like that always gave off something obvious. If evil came wrapped in the kind of face you could instantly distrust. But from everything I heard, he seemed ordinary, not especially handsome, not creepy, not intense. Just a man in a bar speaking softly enough that she had to keep leaning closer to hear him. Over the course of the night, they spent more time together. The conversation became easier with alcohol. Her friends noticed and teased her a little. Nothing serious, just the usual holiday nonsense. At some point, they kissed. Even that, on its own, meant nothing unusual. It was the sort of thing people do on holiday and laugh about later. A stranger in another country. No expectations, no future. Just a brief connection in a place where real life feels far away. But later she said that even while everything looked normal on the outside, something inside her had begun to shift. It was not one clear warning, not a dramatic moment where the room went cold and she suddenly knew she was in danger. It was smaller than that, harder to explain. She said there were little things, a way he watched her when he thought she was not looking, a pause before answering certain questions, the fact that he never said much about himself unless she asked directly, and even then his answers felt thin, as if he was giving her just enough detail to sound open while still revealing almost nothing. Maybe it was none of those things by themselves. Maybe it was only instinct, that strange private alarm that starts ringing before the mind knows what it has noticed. Whatever it was, by the end of the night, she no longer felt fully comfortable. When he asked her to come back to his apartment, she did not say yes right away. She hesitated. He did not react badly. That was another thing she remembered later. He stayed relaxed, smiled, told her they could just have one more drink there where it was quieter, said he lived nearby, said it casually, as if there was no reason at all for her to worry. There was no pressure in his voice, no anger. If he had pushed too hard, maybe it would have been easier to walk away. Instead, the pressure came from somewhere else. Her friends, drunk and laughing and caught up in the holiday mood, started encouraging her. They thought she was being shy. They told her to go on, told her not to overthink it, told her this was exactly the kind of thing people regretted not doing when the trip was over. One of them joked that she was wasting a perfectly good holiday romance. Another told her the man seemed nice enough. And that is the part of the story that always gets to me because it is so believable. Danger rarely arrives with dramatic music. More often it appears in a setting where everyone around you is relaxed. And that relaxed mood makes your fear feel embarrassing. You start thinking maybe you are being rude. Maybe you are imagining things. Maybe you are about to spoil the night for no reason. She nearly went. That is important too. She did not reject him instantly. She did not storm off. She stood there in that loud, ordinary bar, half convinced by her friends, half ashamed of her own hesitation, trying to work out whether she was sensing something real or just being awkward. Then she decided not to go. She told him no, not harshly, not in a way that caused a scene. She just said she was heading back with her friends. That was all. He looked disappointed, maybe a little annoyed, but only for a second. Then the expression passed. He accepted it too easily. That was what she would think about later, over and over. He had accepted it like a man used to, waiting for another chance. She went back with her group that night. They walked home, loud and messy and sunburnt and drunk, not realizing that one small choice had already separated her life into two versions, the one she lived and the one she had almost stepped into. For the rest of the holiday, nothing happened. That made it easier to forget about him, easier to file the whole thing away as one minor moment in a trip full of similar moments. By the time she flew home to Ireland, she was already back in the rhythm of normal life. Laundry, family, recovering from too little sleep. Looking through photos, telling stories about the trip that sounded fun and harmless. Then, about a week later, she started feeling unwell. At first, it did not seem like much, a sore throat mainly. She felt run down and strange in a way she could not quite name. Not seriously ill, just wrong somehow. She assumed it was travel, exhaustion, or maybe the start of some infection picked up on the plane or from too many late nights. The kind of thing people shrug off. But it did not pass. Her throat became increasingly painful. She felt weak. There was a bad taste in her mouth that she could not explain. She may have had swollen glands too, though I cannot swear to every detail now. What I do know is that it got bad enough for her to see a doctor. Even then, no one thought in terms of horror. That is another reason this story lingers. It moved through such normal channels. A girl comes back from holiday, she feels sick. She sees a doctor. This happens every day. There is nothing dramatic about it. The doctor examined her and ran some tests. Maybe he expected a common infection and wanted to be thorough. Maybe something about her throat did not look right. Either way, the results were not straightforward. He could not immediately explain what he was seeing. That unsettled her more than the illness itself. There is a particular kind of fear that sets in when a medical professional, someone whose job is to understand the body, goes quiet for too long. You start to feel your own body as unfamiliar territory. Something was wrong, clearly, but not in a familiar way. She was told to go home and wait for the results. So she did. I have often thought about those days in between. She must have tried to carry on normally. Maybe she made tea and took painkillers and checked her phone every few minutes. Maybe she told herself she was being silly. Maybe she looked up symptoms online and scared herself with possibilities that still fell far short of the truth. Then she got the call. It was not a routine follow-up. The doctor told her she needed to come to the hospital immediately. That word immediately changes the air around everything. It takes whatever vague worry you have been carrying and gives it shape. By then she was frightened, though probably still in the ordinary ways people are frightened of test results. Cancer, maybe. Some rare infection. Something serious but still explainable. She went in. When she arrived, there were police outside. Not one officer by chance. Not someone dealing with an unrelated incident nearby. Police waiting there in a way that made it clear they were part of whatever this was. She later said that was the moment the bottom dropped out of her stomach. Sickness is one kind of fear. Police involvement is another. It meant this was no longer just about her body. Somehow it had crossed into something else entirely. Something criminal, and she had no idea how or why. Inside, she was taken to a private room. The atmosphere was controlled, but tense. People were trying not to alarm her, while also making it obvious that this was serious. The police asked her questions that seemed bizarre at first. Had she traveled recently? Yes. Had she had any unusual food? Had she been in contact with anyone sick? Then one of them asked whether she had kissed anyone recently. It was such a strange question in that setting that she just stared at them. She answered honestly, yes, she had. On holiday. A man she met in a bar. The room changed after that. No one shouted. No one became dramatic. But she could feel something settle into place around her answer. As if she had just supplied the missing piece of a puzzle they were hoping not to solve. Then they told her what the tests suggested. The disease she had tested positive for was extremely rare. Rare enough that most doctors would never see a case in their lives. There were almost no known ways to contract it. In fact, there was only one realistic explanation for exposure in the form she had. It was associated with the consumption of human flesh. At first, she did not understand. The words were too absurd. The mind does that sometimes when something is too monstrous to fit. It keeps trying to turn the sentence into something more ordinary. She had not consumed human flesh, obviously. Then they explained that transmission could happen through intimate contact with someone who had. That was when the memory of the man in the bar stopped being a harmless holiday story and became something else entirely. The kiss, his mouth, the taste of alcohol covering whatever else might have been there, the way he had wanted her to come back with him, the strange unease she had felt and could not explain. All of it swung into a new shape at once. She told them everything she could remember. She described the bar, the night, his appearance, the conversation, the invitation to his apartment. She told them where she had been staying and roughly where he said he lived. She told them her friends had seen him too. She told them she had kissed him and then gone home instead of going with him. The police took it very seriously. That phrase can sound flat on the page, but in real life it means calls being made in front of you. Names written down, timelines built quickly, details checked and checked again. It means realizing your strange, sick, private problem has suddenly become part of something much larger. Irish authorities contacted law enforcement in the country where she had been on holiday. Information was passed on. Officers there began trying to identify the man. Between her description, the location, and whatever else they may already have had in motion, they found him quickly enough. Then they raided his apartment. Inside, they found human body parts in the refrigerator. Even now, writing that feels unreal. It sounds like the kind of detail people add to make a story hit harder, but this was the part confirmed by the investigation. Not rumor, not exaggeration. Human remains stored in the place he had tried to bring her back to. And it did not stop there. As the investigation opened up, it became clear he had done this before. He had been bringing women back to his apartment. Young women, often travelers, often people with no local support system. Women who could disappear into the blur of nightlife. And delayed concern. What happened once they got there was more than murder. He had been eating them. There is no clean emotional response to learning something like that. Relief and horror do not cancel each other out. They sit side by side and make each other worse. She was relieved, of course. Anyone would be. She had gone home. She had survived. But survival is not always simple once you understand what nearly happened. A person can be safe and still become trapped by imagination. Every time she thought back to that night, the ending changed. In one version, she said yes. In one version, she followed him out of the bar. In one version, her friends laughed and waved as she left with him. In one version, no one ever saw her again. That is what haunted her, from what my sister said. Not just the man himself, but the closeness of it. The fact that she had stood only a few words away from a completely different fate and had not known it. I think that is what gives this story its weight. If there had been a chase, if he had threatened her openly, if she had escaped by some dramatic stroke of luck, it would at least have looked dangerous while it was happening. But it did not. It looked like a normal night. A bar, a flirtation, a kiss, an invitation. The danger was hidden so completely inside ordinary life that the only warning she had was a quiet feeling she almost ignored. And if she had ignored it, there might not have been enough left of her for anyone to know what happened. That is not me trying to be dramatic. It is simply the shape the facts leave behind. The whole thing only came to light because she got sick. That part troubles me almost as much as anything else. If she had not developed symptoms, if she had not gone to the doctor, if the doctor had not looked closely, if the test results had not pointed towards something so rare and disturbing that police became involved, he might have carried on. He might have kept doing it. The chain of events that exposed him was so thin, so accidental, that it is hard not to think about all the cases where no such chain exists. A sore throat, a doctor's appointment, a phone call. That was all it took to uncover something monstrous that had been living behind an ordinary door in an ordinary building. People like to imagine that they would spot evil right away. They think they would hear it in the voice, see it in the eyes, feel something unmistakable. But the truth is uglier and less comforting than that. Sometimes evil is patient. Sometimes it learns manners. Sometimes it understands exactly how harmless it needs to appear. That man did not drag her anywhere. He did not have to. He relied on the oldest trick there is, which is making danger look like choice. Making the victim walk toward it freely, smiling, maybe even embarrassed to hesitate. And her friends, without meaning any harm, became part of that pressure. I do not say that to blame them. They were young, drunk, and operating within the same assumptions most people use. Nice bar, friendly man, holiday atmosphere. What is the worst that could happen? That question sounds so innocent until it is answered. I have often wondered what she felt toward them afterward. Maybe nothing. Maybe they were all just grateful she was alive. But I would imagine there was a time when even their laughter from that night might have sounded different in her memory. Not cruel, just unbearably unaware. What stayed with her most, apparently, was not the police or the hospital or even the details from the apartment. It was the moment in the bar when she hesitated. That tiny pause. That private resistance she nearly pushed past. It became proof that some part of her had understood before the rest of her did. People talk about instinct as if it is mystical. But I think sometimes it is just the brain noticing patterns too small or too fast to turn into language. A tone that does not match the words. A smile held a second too long. An emptiness where warmth should be. Whatever she picked up on, it was enough. Barely, but enough. That is why this story still bothers me in a way more graphic ones never have. Graphic stories create distance. You hear them and think, awful, but far away. This one offers no such comfort. It begins in a place most people have been, doing things most people have done, making a decision that could easily have gone the other way. A normal night can carry a person right up to the edge of something unspeakable, without ever changing its face. She walked away and lived. That is the only reason this story can be told at all. If she had gone with him, there is every chance she would have become another missing tourist, another uncertain case in a foreign country, another family left searching for explanations that would never have felt complete. Instead, she trusted a feeling she could not defend, could not explain, and almost did not honor. That quiet choice saved her life. And whenever I think about the story now, that is the part that unsettles me most. Not the refrigerator, not the investigation, not even the knowledge of what he had done. It is the image of her standing there in a loud bar, friends urging her on, a stranger smiling, nothing visibly wrong, and some small voice inside her saying, no. A voice that, for once, was listened to. This isn't a story my mother ever sat me down and told me directly. For most of my life, I didn't know it at all. I only learned the truth in fragments, slowly, over time. And when it finally came into focus, it unsettled me in a way I still haven't fully processed. I didn't hear it from her in some quiet, careful conversation. I heard it while she was speaking to psychologists, with me sitting there in the room, listening as if they were talking about someone else's life instead of the woman who raised me. My mom found her own mother's corpse when she was a child. Even writing that feels heavy. It is the kind of fact that drops into your mind and stays there, impossible to soften. She never turned to me and said those words plainly. She never sat me down and explained what happened or what it was like. I heard it spoken aloud in a clinical, careful way by people trying to understand her mental health. And I remember sitting there feeling as if the ground underneath everything I thought I knew about my family had quietly shifted. That discovery did not happen in isolation. It was part of a chain of events no child should ever have to live through. When my mom was very young, her sister died. She was just a child too. From what I understand, she ran into the street without looking and was hit by a car. It was sudden, violent, and final in the brutal way childhood accidents often are. One moment everything is normal, and the next moment a family is permanently broken. I cannot imagine what that kind of loss does to a household, especially in a time when grief was not talked about the way it is now, when people were expected to keep going whether they were ready or not. Not long after her daughter's death, my mom's mother took her own life. She died by hanging. The timing matters. Losing a child is devastating under any circumstances, but losing one and then ending your own life soon after creates a kind of wreckage that never really settles. It leaves behind no resolution, no clean ending, only one absence piled on top of another. My mom was very young when this happened. Too young to understand death properly, let alone suicide. Too young to understand grief, guilt, or mental illness. She was a child living inside an adult tragedy, and she was the one who found the body. I do not know the details of that moment, and maybe it is better that I do not. I do not know where it happened, or how long she was alone with that discovery, nor what she thought she was seeing before she understood it. I do not know if she screamed, or froze, or tried to wake her mother. I do not know if anyone came quickly, or if time stretched out in that horrible, unreal way it does during shock. All I know is that a child walked into a place where her mother should have been alive and found her dead instead. That kind of thing does not just leave a person, even if a child does not have the language to describe it. Even if they do not fully understand what they are seeing, the body remembers. The nervous system remembers. Something deep and permanent breaks in that moment. A parent is supposed to be the constant, the one person a child believes will always be there. When that bond is shattered so violently, especially by suicide, now it leaves wounds that do not always show themselves in obvious ways, but never truly disappear. I am pretty sure this was a major cause of my mom's later mental health issues. Not the only cause, but one of the foundations of them. How could it not be? She lost her sister, then lost her mother, and then had to grow up in the aftermath of all of that, without ever really being given the tools to understand it. Trauma like that does not go away just because time passes. It settles quietly into a person and changes the way they experience the world. Her father eventually remarried. Life went on, at least on the surface. A new woman entered the family, and she became my grandmother in every practical sense. She was the grandmother I knew, the one whose presence felt normal and unquestioned. I grew up believing she was my biological grandmother. No one corrected me. No one sat me down and explained the truth. It was not a lie in the obvious sense. It was more like a silence that stayed in place for years. It took a long time before I realized that my grandmother was not actually my biological grandmother, and it took even longer for me to understand why that had been hidden from me. When I was younger and asked about my mom's mother, I was told she died of sadness. At the time, that explanation seemed strange, but not alarming. Children accept vague answers more easily than adults do. Died of sadness sounded soft, maybe even poetic in a way. I imagined an old woman who had missed someone deeply and faded away quietly. I did not imagine a young woman who hung herself after losing a child. I did not imagine a little girl finding her body. The truth was far darker than the story I was given. As I got older and learned what really happened, I started thinking about how long I lived without knowing any of it. How many years I spent not understanding the full weight of what my mother carried with her every day. How many moments in my childhood were shaped by her trauma without me realizing it. How many of her reactions, fears, anxieties, or moments of distance suddenly made more sense in hindsight. There is something deeply unsettling about realizing that your parent has lived an entire life, full of pain you were never allowed to see clearly. It changes your sense of family history. It makes you wonder what else might be buried, what other truths were softened or hidden to protect you. And it also makes you grieve for a version of your parent you never knew. The child she was before everything fell apart. The person she might have been if she had not grown up inside so much loss. On the surface, this is probably more sad than scary. There are no ghosts in it, no monsters hiding in the dark. But there is something profoundly frightening about the image of a child being the first to discover their own parent's corpse. That alone is horrifying, even without any extra detail. It is frightening because it is real, because it happens, because it leaves marks that can last a lifetime. What scares me just as much is how normal the silence around it became. No one explained it to me. No one corrected the story when I was old enough to understand. But I lived for years without knowing that my biological grandmother died by suicide, without knowing that my mother had found her, without knowing that the woman who raised me carried that memory quietly inside her all along. That gap in knowledge feels strange now. It feels like there was a missing chapter in my own family story that I was never allowed to read. When I think about it too long, it messes with my head. I think about my mom as a child, trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly become unpredictable and unsafe. I think about how grief becomes heavier when it is never properly acknowledged. I think about how children do not stop loving their parents just because those parents hurt them, even indirectly. I think about how confusing it must have been to lose a sister, then lose a mother, and then be expected to keep going as if life would eventually make sense again. I also think about myself, growing up without knowing any of this, and how that ignorance shaped my relationship with my mother, how I sometimes felt distance or tension without understanding where it came from, how I sometimes blamed myself for emotional gaps that were never really about me in the first place, how I did not have the context to see her not just as my mom, but as a survivor of something unimaginably painful. There is something uniquely unsettling about learning traumatic truths secondhand, long after they happened. You do not get to process them alongside the people who lived through them. You do not get to ask questions at the time when answers might have been clearer. You are left reconstructing a past that no longer exists. You trying to understand how it shaped the present. And maybe the scariest part is how quiet it all was. No dramatic confession, no family reckoning, just a child hearing a truth in a clinical room and realizing that her family history was far more tragic than she ever knew. Realizing that died of sadness was a polite phrase for something far more violent and final. Realizing that your mother's pain has roots that go deeper than you ever imagined. I do not know how often my mom thinks about that day. I do not know what memories still surface for her when she is alone, or what dreams still find their way back. I do not know how much of her life has been shaped by that moment, consciously or unconsciously. I just know that trauma like that does not vanish. It settles into the background of a person's life, influencing choices, reactions, fears, and coping mechanisms in ways even they may not fully understand. When I think about it now, it is not just sad. It is unsettling. It is frightening in a quiet, existential way. It reminds me how fragile families are, how much pain can exist beneath normal appearances, and how children often grow up surrounded by truths they are not yet allowed to know. It also makes me realize how much compassion my mother deserved, even in the moments when it was hard to give. I still think about how long I did not know any of this, how much was hidden behind simple phrases and omissions, and how learning it later did not just change how I see my mom, but how I see myself, my family, and the weight of the past we all carry, whether we know it or not. Tim McLean was a 22-year-old Canadian man doing something ordinary, something so ordinary that it should have been safe. He was riding a Greyhound bus across Canada, sitting in his seat with his headphones on, asleep, just another passenger trying to get from one place to another. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, nothing to warn him, nothing to warn anyone else. He was simply there, resting like people do when they believe they are surrounded by strangers in a public place that should protect them. The man sitting next to him was Vincent Lee. Without warning and without any argument or reason that anyone on the bus could understand, Lee pulled out a large knife and attacked him. Tim never had a chance to react. He was asleep when it began. The first signs that something was wrong reached the other passengers only as confusion at first, a struggle they could hear before they could fully understand it. Then came the panic, sharp and immediate, spreading through the bus as people realized this was not some brief altercation or accident. Something terrible was happening, and it was happening in front of them. The driver did what he could. He pulled the bus over and ordered everyone off. People scrambled down the aisle and out into the open air in shock, leaving behind the life they had been carrying just seconds before. A few men, including the driver, tried to help. They tried to stop what was happening. They tried to save Tim, but they were met with violence and pushed back. The attacker locked himself inside the bus, and the rest of the passengers were left outside, the helpless, unable to do anything but watch. What came next unfolded in full view of the people standing on the roadside. Lee continued the attack after everyone else had fled. At one point, he showed the passengers what he had done through the windows of the bus. People outside were screaming, crying, vomiting, and shaking with shock. Some could not even keep standing. No one could get back onto the bus without risking their own lives, and no one outside could do anything to stop what was happening inside. They could only wait for police and stare at a nightmare they could not stop from becoming real. Afterward, Lee stayed on the bus for hours, alone with the body, while police surrounded the vehicle. When officers finally entered, they found the full extent of the horror. Parts of Tim's body had been removed and placed in bags. The other parts were found on Lee himself. Some were never recovered. Even written carefully, the facts are hard to hold in the mind without feeling sick. What makes this case so disturbing is not only the violence itself, but how completely it destroyed the idea of safety in a normal place. A bus is supposed to be ordinary. It is supposed to be boring, predictable, even comforting in its routine. People sleep there. People sit there with their bags and their music and their thoughts. They trust that the worst thing they will face is a delay. Tim McLean was doing exactly that. He was not taking a risk. He was not looking for danger. He was simply sleeping in public, surrounded by strangers. And that was enough to put him in the path of something beyond comprehension. The aftermath upset people almost as much as the crime. Vincent Lee was diagnosed with schizophrenia and found not criminally responsible because of mental illness. He was sent to a psychiatric facility instead of prison. Over time, doctors said his condition was treated, that his medication was effective, and that he was no longer considered a danger. Eventually, he was released. Later, he was allowed to live in the community without supervision under a new name. For many people, especially Tim McLean's family, that felt like a second injury layered on top of the first. A young man had been killed in one of the most horrifying ways imaginable, and the person responsible was eventually allowed back into society. The legal system saw treatment and recovery. Many members of the public saw something else entirely, something that felt impossible to forgive or accept. That is why this case still unsettles people. It is not just about violence. It is about the collision between illness, responsibility, public safety, and justice, and how none of those ideas fit together neatly when the crime is this extreme. Schizophrenia is a serious and devastating illness, and people who suffer from it deserve treatment and care. But the scale of what happened to Tim made it hard for many people to accept that the person responsible could ever truly be seen as safe again. What lingers most is the randomness of it. Tim did not provoke anyone. He did not do anything wrong. He was not in a dangerous place or living recklessly. He was just a young man on a bus, asleep, vulnerable in the ordinary way. People are vulnerable when they believe the world around them is still within reason. That is what makes the story so hard to forget. It shows how fragile normal life can be, and how quickly it can be destroyed by something no one sees coming. For a lot of people, this case became one of those things they think about whenever they board a bus or sit next to a stranger, not because they expect the same thing to happen again, but because once you know a horror like this is possible, you can never completely unknow it. It changes the way public spaces feel. It changes the way you look at quiet people, sleeping passengers, and the small illusion of order that surrounds everyday life. Tim McLean is remembered not only as a victim, but as a reminder of how fast ordinary life can be torn open. What happened to him was real, brutal, and so far outside normal experience that even restrained language struggles to contain it. That is part of what makes it unforgettable. It is not a ghost story. It is not a myth. It is not exaggerated. It happened, and the reality of it is what makes it so hard to shake.